In the Louisiana State Archives, there exists a peculiar inventory list from an estate sale conducted in 1853. Among the standard entries for furniture, livestock, and human property, one item stands out: a door. Not the mansion itself, not the land, not any of the profitable assets one would expect, just a door. The listing specifies that this door must never be installed in any structure where people reside, must never be opened after sunset, and must never, under any circumstances, be destroyed. The door sold for 3 times the price of the plantation house it once belonged to. Buyers traveled from as far as Boston and Philadelphia to bid on it, though none would explain why. The winning bidder, a professor of mental philosophy from Yale College, transported the door to Connecticut, where it remained in a locked warehouse until his death in 1871. His widow had it burned, or tried to. The door wouldn't catch fire. After 6 attempts with different accelerants, she had it buried in a pine box 12 feet deep on the edge of her property. 3 months later, a sinkhole opened at that exact spot. The door was found at the bottom, undamaged, the pine box rotted to fragments around it. Eventually, the door disappeared from all records. But what that door witnessed between 1832 and 1851 remains documented in the testimonies of 43 people who survived crossing its threshold. Tonight, we examine what happened at Bellemont Plantation and why a simple doorway became the site of the most psychologically devastating ritual in American slavery's long catalogue of horrors. Before we continue with the story of Baron Laurent Christophe Delacroix and the door that no one could pass unchanged, if stories like this fascinate you, stories they tried to bury along with that door, subscribe to The Sealed Room and turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These events happened in Louisiana, but their echoes reached every corner of this country. The horror of what we're capable of doing to each other knows no borders. Now, let's discover what awaited those who approached Delacroix's door. Bellemont Plantation occupied 1,100 acres along Bayou Lafourche, 30 miles southwest of New Orleans. The land produced sugar cane, which meant the labor was brutal even by the standards of cotton plantations further north. Sugar production required constant attention, dangerous machinery, and processing that couldn't wait for weather or exhaustion. The enslaved population at Bellemont numbered 167 people in 1832 when Laurent Delacroix inherited the property from his uncle, Armand Delacroix, who had died of yellow fever without legitimate heirs. Laurent arrived from Paris in late September, accompanied by 7 trunks of books, 2 crates of scientific instruments, and a letter of introduction from the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. He was 34 years old, educated at the Sorbonne, unmarried, and according to the New Orleans Society papers that noted his arrival, possessed of significant inherited wealth beyond the plantation itself. He could have lived comfortably in Paris on his investments. He chose instead to come to Louisiana, and the reason why became apparent within weeks of his arrival. The main house at Bellemont was a raised Creole cottage, built high off the ground to avoid flooding, with galleries wrapping around all 4 sides and 22 exterior doors. Laurent ordered 21 of those doors removed and bricked over within his first month. Only one entrance remained, the front door, facing east toward the bayou. This door became the sole point of entry to the house for everyone, enslaved or free, family or stranger, overseer or field hand. But entry was not simply a matter of turning a handle and walking through. Laurent established what he called the protocol of approach, a series of actions required of every person before they could cross his threshold. Among the enslaved community at Bellemont, a woman named Celeste served as head of the house staff. She had lived her entire 38 years at Bellemont, first under the elder Armand Delacroix, who had been cruel in the casual, unthinking way of men who never questioned their right to own other humans, but whose cruelty at least followed predictable patterns. She had survived the cholera outbreak of 1829 that killed 32 people at Bellemont. She had buried 3 of her own children to fever and 1 to drowning in the bayou. She had borne a daughter, Josephine, to Armand's son, Claude, before Claude died in a duel in New Orleans. That daughter, now 16, worked in the house alongside her. Celeste had learned to navigate survival through careful observation, knowing when to speak and when silence served better, understanding the rhythms of plantation life, the way she understood the rhythms of the bayou itself, the rising water, the storm seasons, the migrations of birds that signaled changes coming. Laurent Delacroix was a change she could not predict. He summoned her on his third day at Bellemont. She approached the main house the way she always had, climbing the front steps, preparing to knock on the door. Laurent met her on the gallery before she could knock. He held a leather-bound notebook and a measuring tape. Behind him, the door stood closed. "You will not enter today," he said in French. Celeste spoke French fluently, as did most of the enslaved community at Bellemont. The elder Delacroix had insisted on it. "Your entry requires preparation. Tomorrow morning, 1 hour after dawn, you will return. You will bring with you a white cloth, approximately 12 inches square, and a cup of water from the bayou. You will approach the door, but stop precisely 10 feet from the threshold. I will instruct you further at that time." Celeste stared at him, trying to understand. "Sir, I need to prepare the house for your residence. The rooms require cleaning." "Tomorrow," Laurent repeated. He turned and entered the house, closing the door behind him. The lock clicked with a finality that suggested no further discussion. That evening, Celeste gathered with other members of the house staff in the quarters behind the main house. There was Jean-Baptiste, who had served as butler under the elder Delacroix. There was Marie, who cooked. There was Théo, who maintained the fires and carried water. There was her daughter Josephine and Josephine's half-sister on her father's side, a girl named Isabelle, who had been raised in the house after Claude's wife died. They discussed Laurent's strange demand, trying to make sense of it. "Maybe it's something from France," Marie suggested. "Some European custom we don't know about." "No European I ever heard of requires you to bring bayou water just to enter a house," Jean-Baptiste said. "He's doing something else. Testing us, maybe, seeing how well we follow orders." Celeste said nothing, but she felt uneasy in a way she couldn't name. The request was specific without being explained. That combination suggested Laurent had clear purposes she couldn't yet see. The next morning, Celeste approached the main house, carrying a white cloth torn from an old sheet and a tin cup filled with murky bayou water. She stopped 10 feet from the door, as instructed. Laurent emerged onto the gallery, again carrying his notebook. He studied her for a moment, then descended the steps to stand beside her. "Place the cup on the ground at your feet," he said. "Unfold the cloth completely. Hold it in both hands, arms extended forward at shoulder height." Celeste obeyed. The morning air was cool, and she could smell wood smoke from the kitchen building and the green rot scent of the bayou. "Now," Laurent said, "you will walk forward exactly 5 paces. Count each pace aloud as you take it. When you reach 5, you will stop and wait for further instruction." Celeste walked forward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, formal and distant. She stopped, holding the cloth extended, her arms already beginning to ache slightly. Laurent circled around her, maintaining distance, observing. "Good. Now lower the cloth to waist level and fold it into quarters. Each fold must be precise. The corners must align exactly." Celeste folded the cloth carefully, aware of his scrutiny. The pressure to perform this simple task correctly felt disproportionate to its difficulty, but she focused, making each fold as exact as possible. "Now, return to where you placed the cup. Walk backwards. Do not turn around." Walking backwards felt awkward, vulnerable. Celeste moved slowly, counting her steps mentally until her heel touched the cup. She stopped. "Pick up the cup without spilling any water. Hold it in your left hand. Hold the folded cloth in your right hand. Approach the door. Stop at the threshold, but do not cross it yet." Celeste moved forward again, balancing the cup carefully. She reached the threshold and stopped, standing in the doorway's shadow, feeling the slight temperature difference between the sun-warmed gallery and the cooler air inside the house. Laurent came to stand beside the door, his notebook ready. "Now," he said, "you will pour exactly half the water onto the threshold, not inside the house, not on the gallery, precisely on the line where they meet. While you pour, you will recite the following: I seek permission to enter, I bring nothing forbidden, I leave nothing unclaimed. Repeat it back to me." Celeste repeated the words. They felt heavy in her mouth, like speaking them created some kind of contract she didn't understand. "Pour the water and speak the words." Celeste tilted the cup slowly, watching the brown bayou water spill across the wooden threshold. "I seek permission to enter. I bring nothing forbidden. I leave nothing unclaimed." The water pooled for a moment, then began soaking into the wood, darkening it. "Now step across the threshold with your right foot first. Place the folded cloth on the floor just inside the door. You may enter." Celeste stepped inside. The house was dim, shutters still closed from yesterday. Laurent followed her in, writing rapidly in his notebook. The scratching of his pen was the only sound. "You performed adequately," he said without looking up from his writing. "Tomorrow, the protocol will include additional requirements. You will bring the same items, but you will also need to memorize a second recitation. I will teach it to you before you leave today." Celeste stood holding the half-empty cup of bayou water, trying to process what had just happened. "Sir, may I ask the purpose of these requirements?" Laurent looked up from his notebook. His eyes were grey, she noticed, and very focused. "Purpose is not your concern. Compliance is your concern. The protocol serves functions you need not understand to perform correctly. Now, let me teach you tomorrow's recitation." Over the next hour, Laurent made Celeste repeat phrases in French until she could recite them perfectly. The phrases made no sense to her. They referenced doors and thresholds and passages, concepts that seemed philosophical rather than practical. When he was satisfied with her memorization, he dismissed her to begin her actual work, cleaning and preparing the house. That night, Celeste taught Josephine the protocol. Her daughter learned quickly, her young memory capturing the sequence of actions and words with ease. But Josephine asked the question Celeste had been avoiding. "Mama, what happens if someone can't do it right? What happens if they spill all the water or forget the words?" Celeste had no answer. They would discover the consequences soon enough. The protocol expanded rapidly. Within a week, Laurent required everyone who entered the house, enslaved or free, to perform increasingly elaborate actions. The white cloth had to be folded in a specific 8-step sequence. The bayou water had to be collected at a particular time of day. The recitations grew longer, more complex. People had to approach the door at precise angles, measured with strings Laurent provided. They had to knock in specific rhythms. They had to present objects for his inspection, personal items that he would examine and judge as acceptable or unacceptable for entry. Jean-Baptiste was the first to fail. He approached the door on a Thursday morning, performed the cloth folding correctly, carried his bayou water without spilling, recited the required phrases. But when he presented his personal object, a small wooden cross his mother had carved for him, Laurent examined it and shook his head. "This object carries unapproved intentions. You may not enter today. Return tomorrow with a different object." Jean-Baptiste stared at him. "Sir, this is all I have. My mother made it before she died. It's the only thing I own that has meaning." "Then tomorrow, you will discover what else might have meaning," Laurent said. He turned and went inside, leaving Jean-Baptiste standing on the gallery, holding his mother's cross. That evening, Jean-Baptiste sat in his cabin, staring at the few possessions he had: a cup, a blanket, a knife for eating. Nothing that carried the weight of memory and love the way his mother's cross did. He spent the night trying to decide what object to bring, knowing that whatever he chose would be weighed against the one thing he truly valued and found wanting. The next morning, he brought the eating knife. Laurent examined it, wrote something in his notebook, and permitted entry. But Jean-Baptiste moved through the house that day like a man who had lost something irreplaceable, which in a sense he had. The protocol had taken not just an object, but his right to decide what held meaning for him. Marie failed 3 days later. She performed every step correctly until the final recitation, where she transposed 2 words, saying unclaimed before forbidden instead of the reverse. Laurent stopped her immediately. The sequence is specific. Words have order. Return tomorrow and demonstrate that you can maintain that order. Marie returned the next day and performed perfectly, but the fear of making the same mistake created new anxiety. She began practicing the recitations constantly, whispering them while she cooked, while she walked to the well, while she lay in bed at night. The protocol occupied her mind, even when she wasn't performing it. By October, the protocol had grown to include 23 distinct requirements. By November, 31. The enslaved community adapted, helping each other memorize sequences, practice movements, master the timing. They developed collective strategies for survival, sharing techniques for remembering the order of actions, creating mnemonics for the recitations, supporting each other through failures. But the psychological toll accumulated. People who had once moved through their work with efficiency born of long practice now approached every task with obsessive attention to detail, as though the protocol's demands had infected their entire understanding of what adequate performance meant. Theo developed a habit of counting his steps everywhere he walked, unable to stop measuring and quantifying his movements. Marie began weighing ingredients with compulsive precision, trying to achieve exactness in everything she did. Josephine started having nightmares about standing at the threshold, unable to remember the words, watching the door remain closed forever. Celeste watched these changes with growing dread. The protocol was not just controlling their access to the house, it was reshaping their minds, creating a population of people who policed themselves more effectively than any overseer could, who internalized Laurent's standards and judged themselves by his arbitrary measures of adequacy. Then, in December, Laurent announced a modification that made everything worse. He summoned the entire house staff to the gallery and explained that the protocol would now include individual variations. Each person would have unique requirements tailored specifically to them. These requirements would change monthly, ensuring that no one could simply memorize a routine and perform it automatically. The unpredictability was the cruelest addition. It meant that even perfect past performance guaranteed nothing about future success. It meant constant vigilance, constant anxiety, constant awareness that any entry might be denied for reasons they couldn't anticipate. Celeste's individual requirement arrived on a cold morning in January of 1833. Laurent informed her that from that day forward she must bring not just bayou water, but water she had personally blessed. He did not specify how to bless water or what constituted acceptable blessing. She was left to guess, to invent her own ritual within his ritual, knowing that her invention would be judged and might be found insufficient. She tried everything. She prayed over the water in the Catholic manner the elder Delacroix had forced them to practice. She held the cup under moonlight, remembering fragments of rituals her grandmother had whispered about before dying, old ways from before the crossing. She added salt she traded for, thinking perhaps blessing meant purification. Each morning, she brought her blessed water to the threshold, and each morning Laurent examined it with instruments she didn't understand, small glass vials and papers that changed color when touched to liquid. Sometimes he permitted her entry. Sometimes he did not. She could find no pattern, no way to predict what he considered adequately blessed. The randomness was intentional, she realized. He was measuring not her ability to perform a task correctly, but her psychological response to impossible standards. She was not being tested. She was being studied. Josephine's individual requirement was different but equally cruel. She had to approach the door carrying 3 objects, but only present 2 of them. The third object had to be kept hidden on her person. Laurent would then guess which object she had concealed. If he guessed correctly, she could not enter. If he guessed incorrectly, she could. But the objects had to be different each day, and they had to be items of personal significance. The requirement forced Josephine to constantly sacrifice meaning, to bring 3 precious things knowing that one would be rejected, that revealing any pattern in what she chose to hide would allow Laurent to predict her choices. She began bringing objects that meant nothing to her, trying to protect what actually mattered. But Laurent noticed this strategy. The objects must matter to you, he told her one morning after she had brought 3 identical buttons. If I determine that you are bringing items of no significance, you will be barred from the house for 1 week. So Josephine had to genuinely value what she brought, had to truly care about what she concealed, and had to accept that caring made her predictable, which meant failure. She could not win. The requirement was designed to be unwinnable. Jean-Baptiste's individual requirement involved memory. Each morning, Laurent told him a sequence of numbers, sometimes 8 digits, sometimes 12, sometimes 15. Jean-Baptiste had to remember this sequence throughout the day while performing his duties. When he finished work in the evening and prepared to exit the house, he had to recite the numbers back in reverse order. If he failed, he could not leave through the front door. He would have to exit through a window, climb down from the gallery, and walk the long way around the house to reach the quarters. The punishment seemed minor compared to denied entry, but having to exit through a window marked failure publicly. Everyone could see him climbing out, could know he had forgotten the numbers. The shame of visible failure added psychological weight to what should have been a simple memory task. More disturbing was what the requirement did to Jean-Baptiste's daily work. He could not fully concentrate on any task because part of his mind had to constantly rehearse the numbers. He burned himself on a kettle because he was mentally reciting Laurent's sequence instead of paying attention. He dropped dishes. He forgot instructions from Marie about meal preparations. His work quality deteriorated because the protocol occupied cognitive space he needed for actual labor. Laurent documented all of this. Celeste saw him watching from windows, making notes about their mistakes, recording how long it took each person to complete the entry protocol, measuring the time between their arrival at the door and their actual crossing of the threshold. He was quantifying their suffering, turning their psychological deterioration into data. In February, a new worker joined the house staff. His name was Gabriel, purchased from an estate sale in New Orleans after the previous owner died of consumption. He was 23 years old, had worked in a merchant's household in the city, spoke English and French and some Spanish, could read and write, and had never worked on a plantation before. The protocols of survival in an urban household were different from those required at Bellemont. He had to learn everything quickly. Celeste took responsibility for teaching him the door protocol. They spent 3 evenings practicing the sequences, the recitations, the precise movements required. Gabriel learned quickly, his education making memorization easier than it might have been otherwise. But Celeste saw him struggle with the arbitrariness of it all. But what is the purpose? He kept asking. Why does the water need to come from the bayou specifically? Why must the cloth be folded in this exact pattern? What does any of this accomplish? It accomplishes control, Celeste finally said. That's the only purpose. He wants to see if we'll do meaningless things simply because he demands it. He wants to measure how much absurdity we'll accept before we break. Gabriel stared at her. That's monstrous. Yes, Celeste agreed. But it's the reality we inhabit. You can recognize it as monstrous and still have to perform it. Understanding doesn't free you from the requirement. Gabriel's first attempt at the door protocol occurred on a Tuesday morning. He carried his bayou water, his folded white cloth, and the personal object Laurent required, a small brass button from a coat his father had worn. He approached the door at the specified angle, stopped at the measured distance, performed the cloth folding sequence. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost perfect. But when he recited the threshold words, he spoke them in English instead of French. The phrases he had memorized came out in the wrong language, an unconscious reversion to his more comfortable tongue under the stress of performance. Laurent stopped him immediately. The recitations must be in French. You will return tomorrow. Gabriel stood frozen for a moment, the incorrectness of his mistake only now registering. "I apologize, sir. I know the French words. I simply misspoke. May I attempt again?" "The protocol permits no second attempts on the same day." "Tomorrow." Laurent went inside. Gabriel remained on the gallery, staring at the closed door, holding his father's button. Celeste, watching from the kitchen building, saw the expression on his face. Not anger or resentment, but something closer to betrayal. As though he had expected that education, that literacy, that experience in a merchant's household would somehow protect him from this. As though being able to read and write should have exempted him from the cruelty of meaningless rituals. That night, Gabriel sat with the others in the quarters, listening to their advice about managing the protocol's demands. "You have to empty your mind of questions," Marie told him. "Just do the actions, don't think about why. Thinking makes it harder." "Practice the French until it's automatic," Jean-Baptiste added. "Make it so natural that stress can't push you back to English." But Gabriel seemed unable to accept the advice. "I keep thinking that if I could just explain to him, if I could demonstrate that I understand what he's trying to accomplish, maybe he would see that the protocol is unnecessary, that we can be obedient without these elaborate demonstrations." "He won't see that," Josephine said quietly, "and because he wants the demonstrations, the obedience isn't enough for him. He wants us to participate in our own humiliation. He wants us to internalize his authority so completely that we judge ourselves by his standards, even when he's not watching." Gabriel looked at her. "You're 16 years old. How did you understand that so clearly?" "Because I've been performing his requirements for 5 months. Josephine said, "and I've watched what it does to people, to my mother, to all of us. It doesn't just control our actions, it colonizes our thoughts. We start believing that his judgment matters, that his approval means something, that failing his arbitrary tests reflects some genuine inadequacy in us rather than the cruelty in him." The next morning, Gabriel performed the protocol perfectly. French recitations flawless, movements precise, timing exact. Laurent permitted him entry. But Celeste noticed that Gabriel moved through the house that day with a kind of defeated awareness, as though successful performance felt worse than failure because it meant submission was complete. By March, the door protocol had become so complex that completing it required approximately 30 minutes for each person. The time investment alone was significant. 30 minutes of labor lost every day to meaningless ritual. Multiply that by the 7 primary house servants, and Laurent was sacrificing 3.5 hours of productive work daily to maintain his experiment. But the productivity loss didn't concern him. The plantation continued operating profitably because the field labor, brutal and continuous, generated the actual wealth. The house was simply the laboratory where Laurent conducted his research into human psychology and control. Celeste began noticing other changes in how Laurent structured their environment. He had installed mirrors at strategic points throughout the house, angled so that people could see themselves performing their daily tasks. The constant visual reminder of being observed, of being watchable, created additional self-consciousness. People adjusted their behavior not just when Laurent was present, but constantly, because they might at any moment catch sight of themselves in the mirrors and imagine his judgment of what they saw. He also began requiring verbal reports. At the end of each day, each house servant had to provide a detailed account of everything they had done, every task completed, every movement between rooms. These reports took another 20 minutes per person. Laurent recorded them in his notebooks, sometimes asking questions about why a particular task had taken longer than expected or why someone had chosen to clean one room before another. The reports created retrospective anxiety. People had to remember not just what they had done, but be able to explain their choices, justify their priorities, defend their efficiency. Work became less about completing tasks and more about creating narratives of work that would satisfy Laurent's interrogation. In April, something shifted. Laurent announced that he would be adding what he called reciprocal requirements to the door protocol. These involved paired actions between 2 people. For instance, Celeste and Josephine would have to approach the door together, perform synchronized movements, recite alternating lines of the threshold phrases. If either person made an error, both would be denied entry. The reciprocal requirements created new dynamics of resentment and dependence. If Josephine stumbled on her recitation, Celeste would be punished equally, despite her own correct performance. If Celeste forgot the sequence of movements, Josephine suffered the consequences. They had to practice together constantly, coordinating not just their actions but their breathing, their timing, their psychological states. One person's anxiety could infect the other. One person's distraction could cause mutual failure. Marie and Théo were paired. Jean-Baptiste and Gabrielle, Isabelle, Josephine's half-sister, was paired with a younger servant named Philippe, who had recently been brought into the house from fieldwork. The pairing seemed arbitrary, but Celeste suspected Laurent had chosen them strategically to maximize either conflict or dependence. The reciprocal requirements also created moral complications. If your partner repeatedly caused failures, you began to resent them, even though you understood intellectually that the system itself was the problem, not the individual struggling within it. If you yourself repeatedly caused failures, you felt guilt and shame directed not just toward Laurent, but toward the person you were harming through your inadequacy. Laurent was making them hurt each other, making them police each other, making them internalize his judgment and direct it toward their own community members. The cruelty was sophisticated, distributed through social bonds, rather than applied directly through violence. Then came the morning that Gabriel refused. It was a Tuesday in late April. The air was thick with humidity that promised afternoon rain. Gabriel approached the door carrying his required items, his partner Jean-Baptiste beside him. They had practiced their synchronized protocol the night before, working through the sequences until they could perform them in perfect coordination. They were ready. But when they reached the threshold and Laurent emerged onto the gallery with his notebook, Gabriel stopped walking. He stood 15 feet from the door, his Bayou water cup in one hand, his folded cloth in the other, and he simply stopped. "You may approach to the measured distance," Laurent said. Gabriel didn't move. Jean-Baptiste glanced at him, confused, then concerned. "No," Gabriel said quietly. Laurent looked up from his notebook. "You are refusing the protocol?" "I am refusing to participate in my own degradation," Gabriel said. His voice was steady, but Celeste, watching from the kitchen doorway, could see his hands shaking slightly. "I have performed your requirements for 2 months. I have done everything you demanded with precision and accuracy. But I understand now what you are doing, and I will not continue to collaborate with it." "You understand that refusal means punishment," Laurent said. His tone carried no anger, only clinical interest. "You understand that you are choosing consequences." "I understand that performing your ritual also has consequences," Gabriel said, "that it damages something in us that no amount of compliance can protect. I would rather face whatever punishment you devise than continue destroying myself by pretending your requirements have legitimacy." Jean-Baptiste spoke quietly. "Gabriel, please, don't do this. We can talk about it tonight. Find another way." "There is no other way," Gabriel said, his eyes still on Laurent. "Either we resist or we become what he is trying to make us. Machines that perform meaningless actions because we have forgotten we are human enough to refuse." Laurent wrote something in his notebook, a longer passage than his usual brief notations. Then he looked at Gabriel with an expression Celeste could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or satisfaction. "You will not enter the house today," Laurent said, "or tomorrow, or any day until you complete the protocol. You will remain in the quarters. You will receive half rations. You will have no contact with other house servants. We will see how long your philosophical resistance sustains itself." He turned to Jean-Baptiste. "You will perform the protocol alone. Your partner's refusal does not excuse your own obligation." Jean-Baptiste looked torn, glancing between Gabriel and Laurent. Then, slowly, he approached the door and began the protocol, performing both his part and Gabriel's, reciting both sets of alternating phrases, doing the synchronized movements as a solo performance that looked strange and incomplete without the partner they were designed for. Laurent watched Jean-Baptiste's performance with apparent approval, making notes about adaptation and individual resilience in the absence of paired support. When Jean-Baptiste finished and entered the house, Laurent turned back to Gabrielle. "I will visit you this evening," Laurent said. "We will discuss your resistance and what it represents. I find your choice fascinating from a research perspective. Subject refusal is a crucial data point." He went inside, leaving Gabriel standing in the yard holding his ritual objects, having chosen defiance and already bearing its weight. That evening, Laurent spent 2 hours in Gabriel's cabin, asking questions about his decision to refuse, about what internal calculation had led him to choose punishment over performance, about whether he truly believed his resistance would achieve anything beyond personal suffering. Gabriel's answers, filtered through the community later, suggested Laurent was less interested in changing Gabriel's mind than in understanding the psychology of rebellion itself. Over the next week, Gabriel's isolation continued. Half rations meant he grew visibly thinner. Denial of contact meant he spent his days alone while others worked in the house. The punishment was designed not just to break him, but to demonstrate to everyone else the cost of resistance. But something unexpected happened. Gabriel's refusal, rather than being seen as foolish or dangerous, became a kind of moral center for the community. People brought him food from their own rations, risking punishment to ensure he did not starve. They visited him at night despite Laurent's prohibition, sharing conversation and solidarity. His resistance, even though it changed nothing about the protocol's continuation, proved that refusal was possible. That humans could still choose defiance, even when victory was impossible. Celeste visited Gabriel on the 5th night of his isolation. She found him sitting outside his cabin, looking thinner but not broken. "You know this won't stop him," she said quietly. "He'll continue the protocol with the rest of us. Your suffering won't change that." "I know," Gabriel said, "but it changes me. I needed to know I could still refuse, that some part of me remained capable of recognizing wrong and naming it wrong, even when naming it costs me everything." "That's a luxury," Celeste said. "Not a criticism, just an observation. You're young enough and new enough here that you still have that kind of strength. Some of us used up that strength years ago, just surviving." "Maybe," Gabriel acknowledged. "Or maybe you have different strength, the kind that sustains people through decades, rather than burning bright in moments. I don't know which is more valuable." "Both are necessary," Celeste said. "Your refusal reminds us we're human. Our endurance keeps us alive. Neither one alone is sufficient." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the bayou, the frogs and insects, the distant splash of something moving through water. Finally, Celeste spoke again. "He's going to break you eventually. You understand that? He'll find the pressure point, the thing you cannot sustain losing, and he will take it from you until you submit." "Probably," Gabriel agreed. "But I will have had these days of refusal. Whatever comes after, I will know that once I chose differently. That has to count for something." Gabriel's refusal lasted 11 days. On the 12th morning, Laurent visited his cabin with a letter. The letter, Laurent explained, was from a buyer in Natchez who specialized in acquiring skilled household servants for resale to plantations in the Mississippi interior. Laurent had written to this buyer describing Gabriel's literacy, his languages, his urban experience. The buyer had offered an excellent price. "I could sell you today," Laurent said, standing in the doorway while Gabriel sat on the cabin's single chair. "The transaction would be simple, profitable for me, devastating for you. Natchez plantations are not known for their treatment of educated slaves. Your literacy would be seen as dangerous rather than valuable. You would likely spend your remaining years in field labor under overseers who consider your education a threat to be beaten out of you." Gabriel said nothing, but his face had gone very still. "Or," Laurent continued, You can resume your position in the house, perform the door protocol, accept the requirements as the price of remaining here, where at least your skills are utilized, where the work is less physically destructive than sugar fields, where you exist in proximity to a community that clearly values you, given their willingness to share rations despite my prohibition. You are offering me the choice between torture and different torture, Gabriel said quietly. I am offering you the choice between calculated cruelty in service of scientific inquiry and random cruelty in service of profit maximization, Laurent said. Neither is humane, but one at least produces knowledge that may eventually serve philosophical understanding of human consciousness and control. The other produces only sugar and early death. Gabriel looked at him for a long moment. And if I refuse both choices? If I simply remain here in isolation, accepting half rations and solitude? Then you will eventually die of malnutrition or illness, and I will have lost a valuable asset for no research benefit whatsoever. That outcome serves no one's interests. It would preserve my refusal, Gabriel said. Refusal that no one outside this plantation will ever know about, Laurent said. Refusal that changes nothing, saves no one, inspires no broader resistance. Martyrdom requires an audience and a cause that outlives the martyr. You have neither. Your death would be recorded as natural causes or perhaps escaped and drowned in the bayou. The narrative would be whatever I chose to make it. The cruelty of this truth settled over the cabin like the morning humidity. Gabriel had defied Laurent's protocol, had demonstrated that refusal was possible, had proven something about human dignity and choice. But Laurent was correct that none of it mattered beyond the immediate moment, beyond the small community at Bellamont. The world would never know. History would not record it. His resistance would disappear as completely as the thousands of other small rebellions that slavery erased from existence. I will perform your protocol, Gabriel finally said, but understand that my compliance is not acceptance. I am choosing survival over principle, because survival at least allows the possibility of future resistance. Death is final. Laurent wrote something in his notebook. Excellent distinction. The psychology of strategic submission versus genuine internalization is precisely what I am studying. Your conscious maintenance of internal resistance while performing external compliance makes you invaluable as a research subject. Thank you for continuing to provide such clear data. He left. Gabriel sat alone in the cabin for another hour before emerging to perform the door protocol for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. His movements were correct but mechanical, his recitations accurate but lifeless. He had submitted, but something in how he moved through the house afterward suggested that submission had cost him something irretrievable. Celeste understood. She had made similar calculations countless times over her 38 years. Each choice to comply rather than resist, each moment of swallowing rage to preserve survival, each day of performing whatever was demanded regardless of its cruelty or absurdity. Those choices accumulated into a life, but they also accumulated into a kind of erosion of the self. You could maintain internal resistance while performing external submission, but maintaining that division required constant energy, constant vigilance. Eventually, the performance became easier than the resistance. Eventually, you forgot which was the real you and which was the survival mask. She feared Gabriel was learning this lesson too early, too explicitly. The clarity of his understanding might make the erosion faster rather than slower. In May, Laurent introduced what he called temporal variations to the door protocol. These involved performing certain requirements at specific times of day, according to a schedule only he knew. A person might arrive at the door prepared to perform the standard protocol, only to discover that at that particular hour, different requirements applied. There was no way to prepare, no way to predict. You simply had to attempt the protocol you knew and adjust when Laurent corrected you. The temporal variations created new levels of anxiety because they meant even perfect preparation could result in failure through no fault of your own. You could do everything right and still be wrong because you had arrived at the wrong hour for those particular requirements. Josephine failed 3 times in 1 week because of temporal variations. Each morning she arrived with her 3 objects, prepared to conceal 1 and present 2, only to discover that at that hour Laurent required a completely different protocol. Present all 3 objects, present none, present them in reverse order of personal significance. The rules changed faster than she could adapt, and each failure deepened her sense that success was impossible, that the system was designed to ensure periodic failure regardless of effort or competence. One morning in early June, Celeste arrived at the door to find Laurent standing on the gallery with a stranger. The stranger was a thin man in his 50s, dressed in the severe black coat of an academic, carrying a leather satchel. Laurent introduced him as Professor Edmund Cartwright from the College of Charleston, visiting Bellemont to observe the door protocol and Laurent's broader research into behavioral conditioning. Professor Cartwright will be documenting our procedures, Laurent explained. He represents the broader scientific community's interest in this work. Please perform the protocol as usual. Pretend he is not here. But Cartwright's presence changed everything. Performing the ritual had been degrading enough when only Laurent observed, but adding an audience transformed it into something worse. Celeste felt exposed in a new way, conscious that this stranger was watching her perform meaningless actions, that he would write about it, discuss it with other academics, present her compliance as evidence, supporting whatever theories Laurent was developing. She completed the protocol flawlessly, but afterward, while working in the house, she heard Laurent and Cartwright discussing her performance in the study. Subject A demonstrates remarkable consistency, Laurent said. His voice carrying through the doorway. Celeste stood just beyond, dusting furniture she had already dusted. In 18 months, she has failed the protocol only 7 times. Her success rate suggests either superior cognitive capacity or, more interestingly, a psychological adaptation that allows her to perform arbitrary requirements without the anxiety that undermines other subjects' performance. Or perhaps she simply understands that survival requires compliance, Cartwright suggested. That seems less remarkable than adaptive. Surely any rational being recognizes that submission to power preserves existence. But that is the question I am exploring, Laurent said. At what point does strategic submission become genuine internalization? When does the performance of obedience transform into authentic belief in the authority being obeyed? Subject A maintains she retains internal resistance despite external compliance, but I suspect that distinction becomes less meaningful over time. The mask eventually becomes the face. Celeste stopped moving, standing frozen with her dust cloth, listening to them discuss her psychology as though she were not a person but a specimen. They were describing her internal life, theorizing about her thoughts and beliefs, analyzing her consciousness without ever having actually asked her about any of it. They had observed her behavior and constructed a narrative about her mental state based on assumptions about what compliance must mean. She wanted to walk into that study and tell them they were wrong, that she knew exactly what she was doing, that 18 months of performing meaningless rituals had not erased her understanding of their meaninglessness. But even as she formed this imagined confrontation in her mind, she recognized the trap. If she insisted she retained internal resistance, Laurent would simply document that as another interesting data point. Her protests would become evidence of the very phenomenon they were studying, the persistence of conscious resistance despite behavioral submission. There was no way to prove you had not been broken except by breaking yourself more visibly through refusal. But refusal led to punishment or sale or death. So you continued performing, and your continued performance was taken as evidence that the system worked, that control had been achieved, that compliance indicated acceptance. That evening, Celeste gathered the house servants in the quarters for a conversation she had been avoiding for months. They needed to discuss what Laurent was doing, not just as individual torture, but as a broader project, something he intended to share with others, to publish perhaps, to promote as a model for plantation management. He is going to spread this, Celeste said quietly. The professor's visit is not just observation, it is validation. Laurent wants academic credibility for his methods. If he gets it, if other planters adopt these protocols, if this becomes a recognized approach to managing enslaved labor, then thousands of people will suffer what we are suffering. Gabriel, still thin from his isolation weeks, spoke up. So what do? We cannot refuse collectively. That would be revolt, and revolt means death. We cannot continue performing without resistance because that validates his research. There seems to be no action available that does not either destroy us or support him. Maybe destruction is the only real resistance, Marie said. Her voice was tired. Maybe we have to be willing to burn it all down, ourselves included, to prevent this from spreading. No, Josephine said firmly. Mama, Gabriel, all of you. There has to be another way. If we die, if we rebel and get killed, we are gone, and he just gets new people to experiment on. The protocol continues. But if we survive, if we endure, we carry the testimony of what happened here. Eventually, slavery will end. It has to end. And when it does, we will be able to tell people what was done to us. That testimony matters. Living witnesses matter. Eventually is a long time away, Theo said. Might be decades. Some of us will be dead of old age before slavery ends, if it ever does. Then those of us who survive carry the story for those who did not, Josephine insisted. But we have to survive first. Martyrdom does not preserve memory. Living witnesses do. Jean-Baptiste had been silent through most of the discussion, but now he spoke. There might be something else we can do. Not refusal exactly, but something that undermines his research without getting us killed. What if we all started failing more frequently? Not in ways that look like deliberate sabotage, but small errors that seem like genuine mistakes. If his data shows increasing failure rates despite continued compliance, if we make the protocol less successful over time, maybe we can convince him that the approach does not work as well as he thinks. Laurent would notice, Celeste said. He tracks everything. He would see the pattern of increased failures and investigate the cause. But he cannot prove intent, Gabriel said slowly, warming to Jean-Baptiste's idea. He can document that we are failing more often, but he cannot definitively establish whether those failures are deliberate or simply evidence that his protocol is psychologically unsustainable. If we are careful, if we vary who fails and when, if we make the failures seem random and distributed, we might be able to create data that contradicts his theories without creating evidence of coordinated resistance. It was a fragile plan, barely more than a hope, but it was something. Over the next weeks, they implemented it carefully. Marie transposed words in her recitations at irregular intervals. Theo miscounted his paces slightly. Jean-Baptiste occasionally forgot his number sequences. Josephine sometimes concealed the wrong object. Celeste spilled small amounts of her blessed water. The failures were not frequent enough to seem like deliberate sabotage, but they were more common than before, creating a pattern of declining success rates that Laurent documented with evident frustration. By July, his notebook showed that the collective success rate had dropped from 92% to 78%. He added new requirements, thinking that increased complexity might restore the previous success levels. But the failures continued, persistent and seemingly random, undermining his confidence in the protocol's effectiveness. Professor Cartwright visited again in August, and this time Laurent's presentation was less triumphant. He showed Cartwright the data, explaining that subject compliance remained high, but that accuracy had deteriorated despite continued effort. He theorized that perhaps the protocol required periodic simplification to maintain effectiveness, that excessive complexity might create cognitive overload that undermined performance quality. This suggests the approach has limitations, Cartwright observed, studying the notebooks. If subjects cannot maintain adequate performance despite willingness to comply, then the practical applications for plantation management are questionable. Planters need systems that reliably produce obedience, not experiments that sometimes work and sometimes fail unpredictably. I believe the issue is implementation pacing, Laurent argued. A more gradual introduction of complexity, combined with periodic resets to baseline requirements, might sustain higher success rates. The fundamental theory remains sound. But Celeste, listening from the hallway, heard the defensiveness in Laurent's voice. He was encountering resistance, not through overt rebellion, but through the quiet collective action of people who had learned to game his system, to provide compliance without competence, to perform the protocol in ways that satisfied the letter of his requirements while undermining their spirit. It was not victory. The protocol continued. They still had to approach that door every morning, still had to perform elaborate, meaningless rituals, still had to submit to Laurent's observations and measurements. But they had found a small space for agency, a way to resist that did not require martyrdom or destruction. Then, in September, everything changed. Laurent announced that he would be conducting a public demonstration of the door protocol for a gathering of planters and academics in New Orleans. The demonstration would take place at the Mechanics Institute, a prestigious venue where scientific societies met. He would present his research findings, explain his theoretical framework, and most importantly, he would bring 6 of his house servants to demonstrate the protocol before an audience of approximately 100 people. The demonstration was scheduled for October 15th. Laurent selected who would perform: Celeste, Josephine, Gabriel, Jean-Baptiste, Marie, and Théo. They would demonstrate both the basic protocol and their individual variations, showing the complexity of conditioning that Laurent had achieved. They would be exhibited, their compliance offered as proof of his theories about psychological control and behavioral modification. The community understood immediately what this meant. They would not just be performing the protocol, they would be participating in its legitimation before people who had the power to adopt and spread these methods. Their performance would become evidence used to inflict similar suffering on countless others. "We have to sabotage it," Gabriel said immediately when they gathered to discuss the announcement. "We have to fail publicly, dramatically, in ways that cannot be attributed to simple mistakes. We have to show that audience that we are resisting, that we understand what is being done to us, that Laurent's success is illusion, built on our strategic submission. That will mean severe punishment," Celeste said, "possibly sale, possibly worse. Laurent will not forgive public humiliation in front of his peers." "I know," Gabriel said. "But if we do not resist now, when does resistance ever become worth its cost? When do we draw the line? This is the moment when our compliance matters most to him, which means this is the moment when our refusal would matter most to everyone watching." They argued through the night, weighing the risks, considering the consequences, trying to calculate whether public resistance would achieve anything beyond their own destruction. Some wanted to sabotage the demonstration. Others feared the punishment would extend beyond the 6 performers to the entire community. The debate had no easy resolution, no clear right answer. Finally, Josephine spoke. "I think we should tell the truth, not through failure or sabotage, but through words. We should perform the protocol perfectly, exactly as Laurent wants, and then we should speak. We should name what we have experienced, explain what the protocol really does, make that audience see us as people describing our own torture rather than objects being exhibited." "They will not let us speak," Marie said. "The moment we try, Laurent will stop us. Then we make sure our words are heard before he can stop us," Josephine replied. "We plan exactly what to say. We keep it brief and devastating. We speak truth so clearly that even people who want to ignore it will have heard it. We'll carry it with them whether they acknowledge it or not." It was decided. They would perform perfectly and then speak. They would comply and resist simultaneously, giving Laurent the successful demonstration he wanted and then undermining it through testimony. The plan was dangerous, the outcome uncertain, but it felt like the only response that honored both their need to survive and their need to be recognized as human beings capable of naming their own oppression. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing, practicing the door protocol until they could perform it flawlessly even under the stress of public exhibition. and practicing their words, refining what they would say, editing their testimony down to essential truths that could be spoken quickly before Laurent silenced them. The journey to New Orleans took 2 days by boat along Bayou Lafourche to the Mississippi River, then upstream to the city. Laurent arranged private accommodations for his human property, ensuring they would be well rested and presentable for the demonstration. He seemed nervous in a way they had never seen before, checking and rechecking his notebooks, rehearsing his lecture, making them practice the protocol repeatedly, even though they had already perfected every movement. His anxiety was revealing. For all his clinical detachment, for all his claims about scientific objectivity, Laurent cared deeply about how his research would be received by his peers. He wanted validation, recognition, influence. His experiments at Bellemont had not been conducted in isolated pursuit of knowledge. They had been performed in anticipation of this moment, when he would present his findings and claim his place among the theorists of human behavior and control. The Mechanics Institute was a grand building on Magazine Street, 3 stories of brick with tall windows and marble columns flanking the entrance. The lecture hall where Laurent would present held 132 seats, arranged in rising tiers, so everyone could see the demonstration space at the front. When Celeste and the others entered through the back entrance reserved for servants, they could hear the murmur of arriving audience members, the rustle of expensive clothing, the cultured accents of wealthy planters and educated academics. Laurent met them in a preparation room behind the stage. He wore his finest black coat, and his face was flushed with excitement, barely contained beneath his usual composed exterior. "Today's demonstration will prove the validity of systematic psychological conditioning," he said. "You will perform exactly as you have practiced, no deviations, no errors. After you have demonstrated the protocol successfully, I will deliver my lecture, explaining the theoretical framework and practical applications. This is the culmination of 3 years of research. Do not fail me." They nodded silently. Laurent studied each of them, perhaps sensing something in their stillness, some quality of readiness that went beyond simple compliance. But he misread it as anxiety about performing before an audience rather than determination to transform that performance into testimony. The demonstration began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Laurent took the stage first, introducing himself and his research interests, explaining that he had developed a novel approach to managing enslaved labor through psychological conditioning rather than physical punishment. He described Bellemont Plantation, the controlled environment where his experiments had been conducted, the careful documentation he had maintained over 3 years. Then he gestured toward the demonstration space where workers had constructed a replica of his threshold, the actual door from Bellemont, transported to New Orleans specifically for this presentation, the copper basin, the measuring strings, everything exact. "I will now demonstrate the protocol," Laurent said, "and 6 subjects will perform the complete sequence of requirements as they do daily at Bellemont. Please observe the precision, the consistency, the evidence of thorough psychological conditioning that transforms arbitrary demands into automatic compliance." The audience leaned forward in their seats, fascinated. Celeste could see their faces from where she stood in the wings. Wealthy men in expensive suits, professors with notebooks ready, plantation owners comparing mental notes about their own labor management challenges. They saw her and the others as solutions to problems, as proof that the human mind could be controlled systematically if only you applied the right techniques. Celeste approached the door first. She carried her bayou water, her white cloth, her personal object, a small wooden spoon her grandmother had carved 60 years ago, in a place whose name Celeste had never been told because her grandmother had died when Celeste was 4, and some knowledge dies with those who carry it. She performed the protocol flawlessly. The measured approach, the cloth folding in its 8-step sequence, the recitations in perfect French, the water poured exactly at the threshold line, the single step crossing with right foot first. Every movement was precise, demonstrating exactly what Laurent wanted to show, that human behavior could be shaped with sufficient rigor and repetition. The audience murmured appreciation. Laurent beamed, making notes on his presentation copy. Josephine came next, performing her three-object protocol, concealing one item, presenting two, allowing Laurent to guess incorrectly so she could enter. Her movements were graceful, almost ceremonial, turning the degrading ritual into something that looked from a distance like elegant choreography rather than torture. Gabriel followed, then Jean-Baptiste, then Marie, then Théo. Each performance was perfect. Each person demonstrated complete mastery of their individual requirements. The audience watched with growing excitement, seeing what they thought was proof that enslaved people could be conditioned to perform elaborate, meaningless tasks with absolute precision. That psychological control was not just possible, but achievable through Laurent's systematic approach. When the last person had crossed the threshold, Laurent addressed the audience again. As you have witnessed, subjects can be trained to internalize arbitrary requirements to such a degree that performance becomes automatic. The protocol I have developed creates self-regulating workers who police their own behavior more effectively than any overseer could. This represents a breakthrough in plantation management, a humane alternative to physical punishment that achieves superior compliance through psychological conditioning. He paused, preparing to launch into the theoretical portion of his lecture, and in that pause, Celeste stepped forward from her position just inside the doorway. "If I may speak," she said. Her voice carried clearly through the lecture hall, cutting across Laurent's prepared remarks. Laurent turned sharply. "You may not. Return to your position." But Celeste did not move. "I have performed your protocol for 3 years," she said, addressing not Laurent but the audience. 1,095 days of approaching that door, completing whatever requirements you devised, submitting to your observations and measurements. I have done everything you demanded, with the precision you just witnessed. And I need this audience to understand what that compliance actually means. Laurent moved toward her, but Gabriel stepped forward to stand beside Celeste, then Josephine, then the others, forming a line between Laurent and the audience, their bodies present and solid, their eyes on the wealthy white men in those rising tiers of seats. The protocol Monsieur Delacroix calls systematic conditioning is torture disguised as science, Celeste continued, her voice steady. Every morning for 3 years, I have performed meaningless actions because refusing meant punishment, sale, or death. I have folded cloth in specific patterns that serve no purpose. I have carried water that accomplishes nothing. I have recited phrases that mean nothing, not because these actions have value, but because Monsieur Delacroix wanted to prove that he could make me do them, that he could occupy my mind so completely with anxiety about performing correctly that I would have no mental space left for resistance. The audience had gone absolutely silent. Laurent stood frozen, his prepared lecture abandoned, his face darkening with fury. Gabriel spoke next. I am literate. I read French, English, and Spanish. I can calculate mathematics. I can write with facility. None of those skills protected me from this protocol. Monsieur Delacroix's conditioning does not respect intelligence or education. It simply grinds away at human dignity until you forget you ever possessed it, until you measure your worth by his approval and your failure by his disappointment. Josephine continued, her young voice clear and firm. I am 16 years old. I have spent the last year learning to judge myself by whether I could successfully hide objects from a man who owns me, whether I could sacrifice things I cared about to satisfy his curiosity about my psychological responses. That is what this protocol does. It does not create obedient workers. It creates people who lose themselves, who forget what it feels like to make choices, to have privacy, to be human in ways that are not constantly observed and measured. Jean-Baptiste added, Before this protocol, I could work efficiently. Now I make mistakes because part of my mind is always rehearsing meaningless number sequences. The conditioning Monsieur Delacroix is promoting to you as improved management actually reduces productivity while increasing psychological damage. You are being sold a method that harms both the people it is inflicted upon and your own economic interests." Marie spoke quietly but with devastating precision. The protocol made me question my own sanity, made me wonder if my inability to perform arbitrary tasks perfectly meant something was wrong with me rather than wrong with the demands. That is what Monsieur Delacroix has achieved. Not better workers, but people who have been taught to blame themselves for failing impossible standards. Theo finished. "We performed perfectly for you today, but that perfection cost us 3 years of psychological torture. It cost us our peace, our sense of self, our ability to move through the world without constant anxiety. Monsieur Delacroix wants you to adopt his methods. We are here to tell you that doing so would mean inflicting this suffering on thousands of people across your plantations. We are here to beg you not to." The lecture hall erupted. Some audience members were shouting at the servants to be silent, to remove themselves, calling for security. But others were standing, arguing with each other, demanding Laurent explain why his subjects were describing torture when he had claimed his methods were humane. Professor Cartwright, sitting in the front row, had gone pale, apparently recognizing that Laurent's research had just been publicly exposed as something far darker than systematic behavioral conditioning. Laurent himself seemed unable to speak for several long seconds. Then he found his voice, sharp with rage. "This is coordinated insubordination. These subjects will be severely punished for disrupting this presentation with lies designed to undermine legitimate scientific research." "They are not lies," a voice called from the back of the hall. A man stood, older than most of the audience, wearing the plain clothing of a Quaker. "I am Benjamin Lundy. I publish The Genius of Universal Emancipation. I have been documenting the experiences of enslaved people throughout the South. I came to this demonstration because I heard disturbing rumors about experiments being conducted at Bellamont Plantation. What these people have just described matches testimonies I have collected from others who have survived psychological torture disguised as management innovation. Monsieur Delacroix is not presenting scientific breakthrough. He is presenting evidence of his own systematic cruelty." The lecture hall descended into chaos. Planters were shouting at Lundy, at Laurent, at each other. Some demanded the servants be removed and punished. Others seemed disturbed by what they had heard, uncertain whether to believe Laurent's claims of humane conditioning or the servants' testimony of torture. The careful academic presentation Laurent had planned had become something else entirely, a public trial of his methods, with the evidence standing before them describing their own suffering. Security eventually cleared the hall. Laurent gathered his servants with cold fury radiating from every line of his body, but he said nothing until they were back in the private accommodations, away from potential witnesses. Then he turned on them with controlled violence. "You have destroyed 3 years of research," he said. "You have humiliated me before my peers. You have undermined work that could have transformed plantation management across the South. There will be consequences." "Good," Gabriel said simply. "If we prevented even one planter from adopting your methods, if we saved even one person from experiencing what we have experienced, then the consequences are worth bearing." Laurent struck him, a sharp blow across the face that sent Gabriel stumbling backward, but Gabriel straightened, blood at the corner of his mouth, and met Laurent's eyes without fear. "You can hit me," he said quietly. "You can sell me. You can kill me. But you cannot make what we said untrue. That audience heard us. Benjamin Lundy heard us. Our testimony exists now outside your control. That matters more than whatever you do to us next." Over the following days, the consequences Laurent had promised materialized with calculated cruelty. Gabriel was sold to a turpentine camp in Mississippi, exactly the fate Laurent had threatened months earlier. Jean-Baptiste was sold to a sugar plantation near Baton Rouge, known for brutal conditions. Marie was assigned permanently to field work, removed from the house entirely. Theo faced similar demotion, his skilled labor replaced with the hardest physical work available. But Laurent kept Celeste and Josephine at Bellamont, not out of mercy, but because selling them would look like admission that their testimony had been true, that he was punishing them for speaking honestly rather than for legitimate insubordination. So they remained, still performing the door protocol, still subjected to Laurent's observations and measurements, still trapped in the system they had publicly named as torture. Except something had changed. The protocol continued, but Laurent's confidence in it had eroded. He added no new requirements after the New Orleans demonstration. He stopped corresponding with other academics about his research. He no longer spoke of publishing his findings or spreading his methods. The door remained, the ritual persisted, but the project had lost its momentum, undermined not by outright rebellion but by testimony that had reframed his scientific conditioning as what it had always been: elaborate cruelty. Benjamin Lundy published an article about the New Orleans demonstration in the November issue of The Genius of Universal Emancipation. He quoted extensively from the servant's testimony, described Laurent's research in detail, and raised pointed questions about what it meant that academics were legitimizing torture by calling it behavioral science. The article was reprinted in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, generating discussion about the psychological dimensions of slavery's cruelties. In Louisiana, the article changed nothing immediately. Laurent continued operating Bellemont. The enslaved community continued laboring. The door protocol continued governing entry to the main house. But the story spread through the enslaved communities along Bayou Lafourche, passed from plantation to plantation in whispered conversations, carried by people who understood that what had happened at the Mechanics' Institute mattered even if it had not changed the immediate reality of their bondage. Celeste performed the door protocol faithfully for 18 more years until Laurent's death in 1851. By then, the ritual had become so ingrained in her movements that she sometimes found herself counting steps and measuring distances, even when nowhere near a threshold. Her body trained to precision that no longer required conscious thought. When Laurent died, his nephew inherited Bellemont and immediately discontinued the door protocol, finding it bizarre and pointless. But Celeste discovered that stopping was almost as difficult as continuing had been. The absence of the ritual left a strange void, a daily routine suddenly missing its opening ceremony. The door itself became an object of superstition among Laurent's heirs. The nephew tried to have it removed in 1852, but workers refused to touch it, claiming they heard voices when they approached it, whispers of people reciting phrases in French. The nephew eventually boarded it up, sealing the entrance permanently. When Bellemont was sold in 1853, the door was sold separately, listed in the estate inventory, with warnings about its troubling history. After the war, after emancipation's long legal processes finally reached Louisiana, Celeste left Bellemont. She was 64 years old, had spent her entire life at that plantation, and had no family beyond Josephine, who had married another formerly enslaved person and moved to New Orleans. Celeste followed her daughter to the city, where she lived until her death in 1873 at the age of 84. Before she died, she gave testimony to a researcher documenting slavery's experiences. The researcher asked her what she remembered most clearly about her years at Bellemont. Celeste was silent for a long time, then said, "The door. I remember that door. I remember believing that if I could just perform the protocol perfectly enough, consistently enough, maybe he would see me as human. Maybe my competence would earn recognition. But perfection did not make me human to him. It just proved his theories about control. The door taught me that compliance cannot purchase dignity, that some systems are designed to be performed, not to be satisfied, that survival sometimes requires doing things that disgust you while maintaining enough of yourself to remember the disgust." Gabriel survived the Turpentine camp, though it cost him his health. He lived until 1868, working after the war as a teacher in a freedmen's school, teaching literacy and mathematics to children whose parents had been denied education. He spoke rarely about Bellemont, but when he did, he emphasized the New Orleans demonstration, not because it had changed their immediate circumstances, but because it had been a moment when they had refused to let their compliance be interpreted as acceptance, when they had named their own experience in front of people with power. Jean-Baptiste died at the Baton Rouge plantation in 1856, worked to death in sugar fields that cared nothing for the skills he had developed as a butler. Marie survived to see emancipation, living until 1882 and spending her final years growing vegetables in a small garden behind the house she owned, the first property she had ever possessed. Theo died during the war, conscripted by Confederate forces to build fortifications, killed when Union artillery bombarded the worksite. Josephine lived until 1897, dying at the age of 71 in New Orleans, surrounded by grandchildren who knew their family's story, who understood what their grandmother and great-grandmother had endured and resisted. She had kept detailed oral histories, passed down through generations, ensuring that the Door Protocol and what it represented would not be forgotten even after all the original survivors were gone. The door itself disappeared from records after 1871. Some believed it had finally been destroyed. Others claimed it was stored in a warehouse somewhere, still refusing to burn, still carrying the memory of everyone who had crossed its threshold. In 1893, a fire at a storage facility in New Orleans destroyed thousands of artifacts from the antebellum period. Workers claimed they found a door in the ruins, undamaged despite the intense heat that had melted metal and turned wood to ash around it. But by then, no one could definitively identify whether it was Laurent's door or simply another door that happened to survive. What did not disappear was the testimony. Benjamin Lundy's article remained in archives. Celeste's recorded statements were preserved. Josephine's oral histories were written down by her grandchildren. The story of the Door Protocol survived as a reminder of slavery's psychological cruelties, the ways in which enslaved people were subjected not just to physical violence, but to systematic attempts to control their minds, shape their thoughts, make them internalize the authority of those who owned them. It also survived as evidence of resistance, not the dramatic resistance of rebellion or escape, but the quieter resistance of people who maintained their humanity despite systems designed to erase it, who performed compliance while preserving internal understanding, who chose moments to speak truth even when that truth carried devastating consequences, who survived and then testified, ensuring that their suffering and their resistance both became part of the historical record. The door may have disappeared, but the people who crossed it, who were tortured by it, who resisted through it, they are remembered. Their names, their testimony, their refusal to let compliance be mistaken for acceptance, all of that remains. A reminder that even in the most controlled circumstances, even under the most sophisticated forms of oppression, human consciousness persists. People remember who they are. They recognize wrong. They name it. They resist in whatever ways survival allows. And sometimes, rarely but importantly, they are heard. What do you think about this story? About the door that witnessed so much suffering and the people who refused to let that suffering be unnamed? Leave a comment below. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these buried histories need to be told, subscribe to The Sealed Room, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who understands that the past is never really past. Its echoes shape everything we are and everything we might become. I will see you in the next story, when we uncover another truth they tried to bury. Until then, remember that bearing witness matters, that testimony matters, that the voices of those who survived are the ones that echo loudest through history.